Hello and welcome to the Gaggle Bubble Challenge, and if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely, and I just want to record a short podcast on the unfortunate arc that the second Trump term is following. And that arc is very much the arc that Trump followed during his first term. After a promising start, the United States was supposedly going to move away from the Bush-Cheney era of interventionism, stupid, pointless wars, regime changes, color revolutions, um, getting bogged down in the Middle East, all of that Trump had promised in 2016. But and of course an improvement of relations with Russia, but none of that really came to any kind of fruition. Trump surrounded himself with policymakers such as John Bolton as national security advisor, Mike Pompeo, the sort of psychopathic CIA director, and then Secretary of State, Wild Dog Mattis as Defense Secretary, and it was predictable when you get these people what the final result will be. Now, back then, the excuse that was made by many people, including myself, was that, well, Trump really had little choice. Russiagate, which threatened to destroy his presidency and certainly would lead to his impeachment, possible conviction and expulsion. It just compelled him. He had to show himself to be a neocon in good standing. Otherwise, he'd be out of a job. And so that was the first term. But now, as he starts the second term, he's going along with very much the same program as he did during his first term. And if one wants to figure out, well, why is this happening, then one need look no further than the people he surrounded himself with. And one of the key figures who's dominating the formulation of U.S. foreign policy is his Secretary of State, cum National Security Advisor. No one has held those two positions in his own person other than Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger had a unique place within the Nixon administration because he just enjoyed Nixon's trust. And so Nixon had him doing both roles. But as soon as Ford took over from Nixon in August 1974, he removed Kissinger as national security advisor, and then Kissinger just remained Secretary of State. So it's very unusual for anyone to hold both positions, because the two positions are actually very different. The Secretary of State, obviously, he runs the State Department. He's in charge of the nation's diplomacy, but he's also involved in policymaking. The National Security Advisor is someone who gathers all of the input from all of the different agencies of the US government, and then presents the different views of the agencies to the president with recommendations as to what the respective insights and what advice being proffered by the agencies is. So it's a very different. It's one is involved in collating information and presenting it to the president in a digestible form, and another is involved in diplomacy and policymaking. But Rubio is now doing both, which means Rubio is not only involved in policymaking, but Rubio is involved in controlling what information reaches the president. And so really, as as we've watched gradually over the past few months, the emergence of Marco Rubio as the the master foreign policymaker. And in a sense, we had always expected this. I mean, ever since Rubio first emerged on the scene, he won in 2010. That was the shellacking election, midterms that which was a major rejection of Obama. The the House was captured by the Republicans, and the Tea Party was riding high. And Marco Rubio was, of course, a member of the Tea Party. But almost as soon as he arrived in the Senate, he became a rabid interventionist, a rabid war hawk, and was immediately seized upon by the neocons, who were still smarting over their rejection in the 2008 election and the Iraq debacle. So they were looking for someone to bring them back to power. And they saw this person in Marco Rubio. He was very young, was boyish looking, well spoken, articulate, and straight down the line neocon. And when he ran, as everyone knew, he would run for president. When he ran in 2016, he presented himself as the neocon's neocon. He did, of course, very poorly because the Republicans had no interest in getting another Bush-Cheney light into the White House. And he was easily swept aside by Donald Trump, as I say, running on this anti-interventionist platform. But the relations between Trump and Rubio during that campaign were quite fraught. They traded quite nasty personal insult. So it was a little surprising that they somehow kissed and made up, and Rubio was in the running in 2024 for the VP slot. Eventually, Trump went with J.D. Vance, but Rubio was thought to have the inside track. There was a lot of speculation that Rubio would be selected. It seemed surprising, but J.D. Vance got the spot. But then Trump nominated him for Secretary of State. Pretty much the most important cabinet position in the around. And Rubio said very little initially, saying he's tried to sound very much like Trump, against interventionism, talking about a multipolar world, not Americans aren't going to impose themselves, no regime changes, no color revolutions, and basically, how countries govern themselves, their internal affairs. America is not going to have any say in any of that. We're not interested in that. We're not going to interfere in other countries' internal affairs. It's their business. Democracy is not democracy. It's not about business. So it sounded like, well, okay, well, Rubio was sort of had a change of heart. He's abandoned all of those positions. I'm going to say, okay, well, it's not unusual for politicians to change their minds. I mean, politicians are well-known opportunists. They know which way the wind is blowing, and they move in that direction. But as time has elapsed, we now see Rubio as becoming increasingly influential and dominant within the Trump administration. One obvious example is the extreme position that Trump has taken on Venezuela and Nicolas Maduro. Without even they're not even pretending that this campaign against Venezuela is about regime change. That the Trump administration is determined to oust Maduro from power in Venezuela. Trump tried to do that during his first term. He organized a number of coups. Maduro survived, but so therefore Trump inherited unfinished business. But the driving force of this anti-Maduro spirit in the Trump administration is Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio, his parents were from Cuba, and he's full of the anti-communist, anti-socialist attitudes that prevails among the Cuban diaspora in Florida, and of course that the hatred for the communist regime in Cuba, the hatred for Maduro, it stems from this attitude of these emigres, and that's who Rubio is. So suddenly, the Trump administration is adopting a more aggressive interventionist regime change policy than Biden had or Obama had, which is kind of strange since Biden was the one who talked about the world being divided into democracies and autocracies, and we have to side with the democracies against the autocracies. That was Bidenism. That was exactly the opposite of what Trump was promising. What Trump was, we're not interested in any of that. We're just going to be pursuing what's good for America. We don't really care whether who's Democratic, who's not Democratic, who won a fair election, who didn't win a fair election. We're not interested in any of that. But now apparently the United States is very much interested in that, and is and is determined, claiming that Maduro has no legitimacy. Somehow his government is illegal. Claiming he didn't really win the election last year. Again, all of the sorts of things that Trump wasn't going to do, but now suddenly you're preoccupied with the legitimacy of Maduro. This is obviously driven by Rubio. Rubio has been obsessed with Maduro for years and years, just as he's been obsessed with Cuba for years and years. But on top of that, we're now increasingly learning as to the role that Rubio had played in sabotaging the promised summit in Budapest between Presidents Trump and Putin. So if you recall, we had the telephone conversation between the two presidents last Thursday, so not the Thursday of this week, but the Thursday of the previous week. Trump said, we're going to meet in Budapest. The Russians more or less confirmed that that was going to take place. And as things were spelled out by Trump in his truth, Lavrov and the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and Rubio were to have a meeting. This was, the week after the phone conversation, so it would have taken place last week. They would have a meeting in which they would discuss the parameters of the summit. They would lay the groundwork for the upcoming summit, which was going to take place sometime really within the next couple of weeks. And then last Monday, Lavrov and Rubio spoke on the phone, and this conversation clearly did not go well because the readouts from both the American side and the Russian side were terse, to say the least. I mean, they really, it was just nothing other than to say, yeah, a telephone conversation took place. So obviously they didn't agree on anything, and it was really obvious what the problem was, and it became apparent, in fact, on the Friday before the Monday phone call on that Friday before, when after Trump's meeting with Zelensky, Trump had sent out a truth in which he advocated the freezing of the conflict in Ukraine on the present line of contact. Now, why that was so significant was that we had all assumed, the Russians had obviously assumed, that Trump had abandoned the ceasefire program after the meeting in Anchorage, because up until then, Trump, the EU, NATO, and the usual crowd had been advocating an immediate unconditional ceasefire. But after Anchorage, Trump said, okay, well, the ceasefire is quite pointless. We really need to address the root causes of this conflict. But then when he sent out on Friday night, he sent out that truth going back to the ceasefire idea, then obviously something had badly gone wrong. And that's clearly what happened when Lavrov and Rubio spoke, because Rubio, now armed with that truth from Trump, said, well, okay, fine, we can have our summit, but before the summit, you need to order a ceasefire. Well, the Russians obviously said, well, we've already explained a million times that a ceasefire is a non-starter. Because that doesn't address the root cause of the problem. A ceasefire would simply postpone things, means that there will be another war within a year, 2 years, or whatever. So there's no point in having a ceasefire. I thought, this is what I think Lavrov said to him, I thought you understood this. I thought you understood our position in Anchorage. And this is really, so Rubio then went to Trump and told him, well, hey, look, the Russians are being really unreasonable. You told them to have a ceasefire. Zelensky is ready for a ceasefire, and the Russians, they're not prepared for a ceasefire. Look, the Russians are making a mockery of you. They're they're disobeying you. And from that moment on, Trump decided he was going to go and punish Russia. So Rubio played a key role here, and this has been confirmed in an article in Bloomberg. Here is this is the article. Let me pull this up. Yeah, you can see here the headline: Trump's sudden shift on Putin spurred by Russia critic Rubio. Yeah, Russia critic. Everyone just, because suddenly we will remember all of the vehemently anti-Russian positions that Rubio has articulated over the years in the Senate. And so here's the Bloomberg piece. For months, President Donald Trump resisted calls to slap new sanctions on Russia, believing he could end the war in a deal with Vladimir Putin, including with a quick peace summit in the coming weeks in Budapest. In a dramatic reversal this week, Trump canceled those plans and then went a step further, imposing the first direct sanctions on Moscow of his second term. It was time, Trump said. But the sudden shift also grew from an assessment by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a longtime Russia hawk who once called Putin a gangster, that Moscow had not made any substantive changes to its position, according to US and European officials familiar with the matter. That's what Rubio told Trump. Hey, Russia hasn't changed its position. Russia still says that they're not going to accept a ceasefire. You call for a ceasefire, they're not going to accept a ceasefire. They're defying you. So it was a very deft maneuver on Rubio's part. The people who asked not to be identified discussing internal deliberations said Rubio called off a planned in-person meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov after the two men spoke by phone, and it became apparent the Kremlin was trying once again to slow-walk ceasefire discussions and drag out the war. Well, they're not slow-walking ceasefire discussions. They've already ruled out a ceasefire. So that's, typical tendentious reporting from Bloomberg. Slow walk. There's no slow walk. They never accepted the idea of a ceasefire. Rubio's influence in the administration change of heart signals an even more expansive role for the top U.S. diplomat, who has also advocated for a more aggressive approach to Venezuela as Trump's interim national security advisor. So that is a more aggressive, right? This really aggressive approach where Trump is now he's ordered the CIA to begin planning on overthrowing Maduro. So basically, the CIA would be involved actively in overthrowing him, working with the military, working with opposition figures. But actually, Trump has instructed the CIA to plot the overthrow of Maduro. And Trump has also suggested that missile attacks on Venezuela could be coming soon. So, a very hawkish approach. And, clearly it's Rubio, who is primarily obsessed with Venezuela. His stance contrasted with a more accommodating strategy towards Russia advocated by Trump's longtime friend and special envoy, Steve Witkoff. In other words, Witkoff seems to have lost out. But in recent days, Russia sent the U.S. a plan outlining its terms for peace with Ukraine that rehashed all of its well-known positions, including demands Ukraine give up more territory, as some of the people said. And then on the Russian side, there was also confusion. Russian officials left the Putin-Trump call last week believing the U.S. president had agreed to Russia's demand that Kiev give up the remainder of the strategic Donbass region in return for only modest territorial concessions by Moscow. Now, again, they're always preoccupied with this issue of these territories, which isn't Russia's main concern. And Russia's main concern is obviously a regime change in Kiev, but even more important, which is that there has to be security guarantees for Russia, which means that there can be no NATO presence in Ukraine. Can't be U.S. missiles cannot be based in Ukraine. You cannot have Ukraine turned into a giant aircraft carrier with guns pointed at Russia. That's the main concern. But they always get bogged down in the issue of territories. But a day later, after meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Trump reiterated that he wanted a ceasefire along the current battle lines, an idea that Moscow had rejected ahead of the Alaska summit. Lavrov highlighted this disagreement in his call with Rubio on Monday, but by that point, the summit preparations were falling apart. Yeah, because that was the point. Rubio went into that phone call and demanded from Lavrov a commitment for a ceasefire. Now, of course, Rubio knew perfectly well that Lavrov was not going to accept that. The Russians have been so unambiguous repeatedly that a ceasefire is a non-starter, that to demand it was bound to lead to a rejection. And of course, that's Rubio wanted, and that's what the U.S. foreign policy establishment has wanted during the Biden years, and now obviously Trump himself is committed to the Biden policy, which is just keep the war going. And then while Rubio sat down alongside Witkoff in Saudi Arabia when the administration first pursued direct talks with Russia back in February, his more direct involvement this time around has been a relief for many European officials. Oh, that's so nice that they're relieved. Thank God this war will keep going. So there's been a relief for many European officials who said they were worried that the US, under Witkoff's guidance, could shift too far toward Russia's position, piling pressure on Ukraine to accept Moscow's demands. So that, thank God, they said Witkoff has been marginalized. Now, just to get a sense of what a snake Rubio is, listen to his remarks that he delivered. He was in Israel earlier this week at this newly set up civil military coordination center that is tasked with the running, the security, the governance of Gaza, and there are some 200 U.S. troops in Israel, seconded to this civil military coordination center. So here's Rubio, and just listen how he has adopted wholly the Israel's talking points, which was different from the promise of Trump. Trump, had when he came to the Knesset, and then when he went to Sharm el-Sheikh, he was talking much more about the kind of the multilateral aspect of this agreement. I mean, in other words, that there are a number of powers involved. Everybody has to be on board with this peace agreement. It's not just going to be Israel, Israel, Israel. There's going to be other powers. There's Egypt's involved, Saudi Arabia is involved, United Arab Emirates is involved, Turkey's involved, and they all are going to be, trying to make sure that we move toward phase two. That's the key. Yeah, we got the hostages out. That's it. That's a done deal. But we have to move towards phase two. In other words, in some ways, Israeli withdrawal and self-governance in Gaza. And that's really was always going to be the key. Will there be an administration push to make sure that all the powers, the guarantor powers, will continue to be involved, because they will want to move on to the next phase of the agreement? Because if they're not involved, and if it's just going to be between the United States and Israel, then of course there'll be no deal, and Israel will revert to attacking Gaza in no time at all. And so here's then Rubio speaking, and some, the usual talk. And then he says, I think it's important, by the way, so this is what I've underlined. I think it's important, by the way, that there be more media coverage given to the fact that Hamas has brutalized Palestinians, has brutalized Gazans over the last few days, and that's something to point to. But all of that has to be managed to make sure that in addition to that, we don't have any flashpoints that could derail the broader process. Now, the thing about this brutalization is that Trump himself has realized that all Hamas is doing at the moment is restoring public order in Gaza, which had collapsed as a result of the Israeli occupation, and that now that Israel has partially withdrawn, they're still occupying about 53% of Gaza, but Israel has partially withdrawn, then from the areas from which Israel withdrew, there were gangsters, looters, criminals running the show. And it's these people that Hamas has been cracking down on, not ordinary Gazans. These people, these essential gangsters who were installed into their positions of authority by Israel. It's Israel that has created these criminal who run things because they wanted a rival force to Hamas. So what Hamas has been doing is restoring order. We can't have looters and rapists running the place, even though Israel was the one that installed them. Trump understood this, but Rubio is now just saying, it's all just Hamas. Really, being really terrible, behaving so terribly. They brutalized Gaza. No, they were removing the criminal elements. They didn't brutalize anyone. Um, then he goes on. If you could address, following on your mention just now, disarming Hamas, is that something that the ISF force, so that's the International Security Force, which is part of the next phase that has to be set up, the International Security Force would be engaged in? And if Hamas refuses to disarm voluntarily, is that something that this force would be involved in, forcing them to disarm? And then Rubio says, well, yeah, if Hamas refuses to demilitarize, it'll be a violation of the agreement, and that'll have to be enforced. Well, yes, I mean, the demilitarization is certainly a part of the agreement. However, there is no time-bound sequence as to when all these things are going to be happen. The move towards phase two is not conditioned on the disarmament of Hamas. Yes, disarmament of Hamas is part of the Trump's 20-point plan. But part of the plan is moving towards Palestinian governance. It's ridiculous to expect Hamas to demilitarize without any kind of a movement towards Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and the creation of Palestinian institutions. And they're not, essentially, they disarm and then allow themselves to be massacred by Israel. I mean, of course, they're not going to disarm. Yet Rubio, is suggesting that, well, Hamas is supposed to disarm. If they don't disarm, then they're violating the agreement. So he's repeating Israeli talking points here. And then he says, I'm not going to get into the mechanism by which it is going to be enforced, but it will have to be enforced. I mean, this is a deal, and a deal requires conditions to be met. Again, what's the timeline? These are all things that need to be done, before anyone starts disarming. You don't just suddenly disarm while none of the important elements of an agreement have been implemented. Israel has met their commitments. No, they have not. I mean, this is sort of ridiculous. So first of all, Israel has still been killing people in Gaza, but the humanitarian aid has not been coming in the quantities that were promised. So, and yet Rubio, repeats this Israeli talking point. Israel has met their commitments. They're standing at the yellow line, and that is contingent upon demilitarization. So he's saying that somehow, well, now Israel hasn't withdrawn, Israel is still there, and Hamas should just somehow disarm. Well, and presumably, if Hamas doesn't, then of course Hamas isn't going to disarm. I mean, not going to at this stage. So if they don't disarm, Israel would, according to Rubio's logic, be perfectly entitled to relaunch its war. And that's what he's saying here. That'll have to be enforced. It'll be a violation of the agreement, and that'll have to be enforced. I'm not going to get into the mechanism by which it's going to be enforced, but it'll have to be enforced. So he's giving the green light to Israel by saying something absolutely deceitful, that Hamas was supposed to disarm at this very early stage of the agreement. And then he goes on. So suffice it to say that we're also hopefully going to create conditions where Hamas won't have people, because they'll always, we want to see a Gaza where people can live without Hamas, where they have jobs and so on, where they have prosperity, where they have opportunities. I'm not telling you that it's going to be set up next week, okay? This is a long-term project. But what I'm saying to you is that we want to create the conditions. We want to help create the conditions here so that people in Gaza don't have to be terrorized by Hamas. So look, everything here is just an Israeli talking point. They're terrorized by Hamas. The only thing that needs to be addressed is the removal of Hamas. Israel, of course, is doing nothing wrong. Everything Israel is doing is fine. He's presenting here the basis on which Israel can just simply turn around and say, we're not adhering to the agreement anymore because Hamas has violated the agreement. And we have the U.S. Secretary of State telling us that they're violating the agreement. Therefore, there's no point in going on with the agreement if Hamas refuses to disarm, even though this is, this whole thing. The agreement was a package deal. Everything is 20 points. All 20 points have to be implemented. Not just, oh, well, we'll pick on this, the disarmament, but we'll forget about the rest. All 20 points need to be implemented. But he just simply says, oh, Hamas, they're terrorizing Gazans. And then the usual kind of condescending way in which U.S. policymakers talk about prosperity, they have jobs, as if, that's all people care about, just, well, we'll have jobs and prosperity, their own kind of anything like national self-determination. No, who cares? Yeah, just give them a job. Let the Israelis just give them jobs, some kind of jobs. That's all that matters. The fact that they're treated, in a humiliating fashion when they go to the job and come back from the job, or and all the inspections that they have to go through, all the dressing down by the Israeli armed forces, everything that's inflicted on them, that doesn't matter. Well, they just have jobs. That's all. Anyway, then there's a question on humanitarian aid. You mentioned there's going to be coordinated through here. I wonder if you could say what the role of the UN will be and what role UNRWA might play. Boom, he just jumps in. UNRWA is not going to play any role in it. So UNRWA, which has experience, after decades and decades of experience of providing humanitarian aid, unlike the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, responsible for I don't know how many thousands of deaths of Palestinians, UNRWA has experience in distribution of food and medicine and so on. UNRWA is not going to play any role in it. UNRWA is not going to play any role. And the UN is here, the UN is, and so on, and then it just goes on. We're willing to work with the UN, but not UNRWA. UNRWA became a subsidiary of Hamas. No evidence for that. There's no evidence that UNRWA was a subsidiary of Hamas. And then he said, oh, we'll work with the UN. But the UN, UNRWA is an agency of the UN. And they are the ones who have the experience of working in Gaza. But again, notice what he's done here. He's just repeating Israel talking points. None of the the attempt that Trump at least had made when he was at Sharm el Sheikh, that hey, I'm trying to bring peace. Both sides need to accept the terms of the deal. No, it's all just Hamas has to accept it. And then he says, and the second question is about the technocratic government that would rule Gaza. So this is part of the phase two, which is, we set up this technocratic, whatever that is, Palestinian government, and then that would be overseen by this peace board under the chairmanship of President Trump. So, but here's a question. The technocratic government that would rule Gaza, we're hearing from Hamas that they are a part of the committee that forms this government. Does that not miss all the point of what we're doing here? Well, that's... Yeah. And then he says, he comes along, he said, oh, that's getting way ahead of themselves. I think everyone's talking about this getting way. Well, we're not getting way ahead of ourselves. This is the deal. This is the phase two. This is the part that has to be implemented right now. There's no, getting way ahead of. No. This is important because these are the people who are going to be involved in day-to-day governance. Because if there isn't a day-to-day governance, of course, Israel just stays on. oh, we're just getting way ahead. We don't need to talk about that. I'd rather just keep talking about Hamas. There's a lot of work to be done here. There's got to be some impediments along the way and things of this nature that people put out there. Suffice it to say that everyone that signed on to this plan, all of these other countries agreed, and everyone agreed that Hamas cannot govern and cannot be involved in the governing of the future of Gaza. Again, he comes back to Hamas. Now that is, of course, is also untrue, because while Hamas as an organization cannot be involved in the governance of Gaza, individual members of Hamas, as long as they disarm and as long as they reject violence, can take part in governance. No, they're the people who have experience of governing. I mean, somebody who knows how to run a hospital, knows how to run a water cleaning facility, somebody who knows how to run a sewer, all of the things that you need some expertise, and those are Hamas members, and that was always part of the 20-point plan. That as long as you disarmed and as long as you gave up violence, you would be take part in the running of Gaza, and that applied to members of Hamas. Yet he says that, oh, Hamas cannot be involved in the governing of the future of Gaza. Not what the 20-point plan said. Everyone's agreed to that. No, they're not. And as we're finding out, that's definitely not what Egypt understands the 20-point plan to be. It's not what Qatar understands the 20-point plan to be. But this is deliberately mischievously recast by Rubio to suggest that everything is really all about Hamas. Everything is about the disarmament of Hamas. So what this is showing is that Trump is basically doing exactly the same thing as he did during his first term. He's allowing essentially that war hawk, interventionist, neocon, policy-making elite to take over his foreign policy. And, we had Pompeo and Bolton during his first term, and that their kind of role has been taken over by Marco Rubio. And suddenly we're talking about going to war against Venezuela. Doubtless, with Rubio at the helm, soon there will be the drumbeat for war against Iran, sabotage of this the Gaza, a possible Gaza peace deal, and of course escalation against Russia. Completely the opposite of all the things that Trump had promised. Completely the opposite of the MAGA America First agenda, but very much in keeping with the neocon ideology that Marco Rubio has always espoused. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me, and hope to see you soon. And remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye-bye.